offense of attempted murder, in violation of Revised Code Section 2923.02A, felony in the first degree. Court defendant serve a term of 11 years in the Ohio Department of Corrections. As to specification 4 to count 1, court defendant serve a term of 3 years in the Ohio Department of Corrections. Mandatory.
Iryna Zarutska's story shocked the world. A peaceful journey that ended in a horrific death. But this tragedy was only the beginning. Because what came next was another story. The story of Charlie Kirk. A story where politics, violence, and justice collide. A moment when he himself was attacked. And one day, a gun was fired at him. This wasn't just an incident. It was the beginning of a new chapter. And to uncover it, you'll have to stay with us. Iryna Zarutska was born in Kiev, Ukraine. She was just 23 years old. Her childhood and early life were shaped by a love for art and creativity. She studied restoration at Synergy College in Kiev and dreamed of using her skills to build a meaningful career. Friends and family described her as gentle, determined, and someone who always smiled even when times were hard. After the Russian invasion, her family spent months in a bomb shelter before fleeing to the United States in 2022. The Russian assault on Ukraine turned their lives upside down. Bombs fell across Kiev, forcing Iryna, her mother, her sister, and her younger brother to hide in a cramped underground shelter. For months, they lived with fear as sirens echoed above and their city was reduced to rubble. Her father could not leave the country because Ukrainian law barred men between the ages of 18 and 60 from fleeing. For Iryna, it was heartbreaking to say goodbye to him, knowing she might never see him again. The family eventually escaped and started over in the United States. They arrived in Huntersville, North Carolina, where the challenge of building a new life was immense. They carried with them only memories of their homeland and the hope of a safer future. In Huntersville, North Carolina, Iryna worked in a local pizzeria, learned English, and began taking college classes. Like many refugees, she accepted whatever work she could find. At the pizzeria, she worked long shifts, saving money to support her family. In her free time, she studied English, eager to communicate, to belong, and to take control of her new life. She also enrolled in local college courses, determined not to give up on her education. Neighbors recalled seeing her walking to work, smiling politely even when she was tired. Her boyfriend gave her driving lessons, since the family had never owned a car back in Ukraine. Slowly, Iryna was piecing together the kind of ordinary life she had once dreamed of. A life without sirens, without bombs, without fear. She dreamed of building a new life, but that dream would end tragically. On the night of August 22, 2025, after finishing another shift at the pizzeria, Iryna boarded the Lynx Blue Line in Charlotte. She carried with her the simple hope of getting home safely, of reuniting with her mother and siblings after a long day of work. But that night, fate intervened. Within minutes, her journey would be cut short in one of the most shocking acts of violence the city had ever seen. 34-year-old DeCarlos Brown Jr. would become the man responsible for ending Iryna's life. He was not a stranger to the justice system. Over the years, he had already been arrested 14 times in Mecklenburg County, convictions for armed robbery and illegal possession of a firearm. Each time, his record grew longer, but his life never found stability. Diagnosed with schizophrenia, Brown had stopped taking his medication. His condition worsened as he refused treatment, slipping further into paranoia and violent outbursts. Those who knew him said he often spoke to himself, pacing restlessly, sometimes ranting at invisible enemies. His mother tried to have him committed, but was denied. Despite her desperate pleas for help, the system turned her away, leaving him on the streets with no care and no supervision. Instead, he drifted between shelters, untreated and unstable. Nights spent in overcrowded beds, days wandering Charlotte streets with nowhere to go. His instability was no secret. Neighbors had called authorities, shelter workers had raised concerns, but without intervention, his downward spiral only continued. And in August 2025, that spiral would collide with Iryna Zarutska in a way that would devastate an entire community. That night, Iryna boarded the Lynx Blue Line train after finishing her shift. It was a routine ride she had taken many times before, the familiar sound of the train doors closing, the quiet hum of passengers heading home late. For Iryna, it was supposed to be the final part of her day before reuniting with her family. Surveillance footage shows her taking a seat in front of Brown. The grainy black and white video captures the ordinary moment, a young woman settling into her seat, unaware of the danger just behind her. Brown sits quietly, his hood pulled up, his face hidden. No words are exchanged. No warning signs appear. Just 4 minutes later, he pulled a pocket knife from his hoodie and stabbed her 3 times, at least once in the neck. The attack was sudden, vicious, and unprovoked. Witnesses later described screams of horror as panic filled the carriage. Passengers scrambled for safety as Brown's violence unfolded in seconds. She remained conscious for nearly a minute before collapsing and bleeding to death on the floor. In those final moments, she clutched her wounds, fighting to stay alive. Strangers tried to help, but the injuries were catastrophic. Her life slipped away on the cold floor of a public train, her dreams cut short by a man she had never met. What should have been a simple commute home became the scene of unthinkable tragedy, one captured on security cameras and etched forever in the memory of those who witnessed it. 2 minutes later, Brown stepped off the train, and was immediately arrested by police. Officers who had been stationed in a separate car of the train were alerted to the chaos. Witnesses pointed toward the man calmly exiting onto the East/West Boulevard platform. Brown showed no signs of resistance as he was handcuffed, the pocket knife still in his possession. Commuters on the platform, shocked and trembling, watched as the man responsible for an unthinkable act of violence was taken into custody. Iryna was pronounced dead at the scene. Paramedics rushed into the train car, but the wounds she had sustained were devastating. Multiple stabs, including one to her neck, left her with no chance of survival. Fellow passengers, some in tears, stood frozen in disbelief. For them, this was not only a crime scene, it was a nightmare unfolding in real time. The train where moments earlier people had been quietly riding home was now a place of tragedy. The senseless killing sent shockwaves through Charlotte. News of Iryna's death spread quickly. Within hours, local media broadcast her story, describing her as a young Ukrainian refugee who had fled war only to lose her life in the very country she believed would bring her safety. Social media platforms were flooded with tributes, outrage, and questions. How could this have happened? Why was there no one to stop it? And who was the man behind the attack? Charlotte's mayor, Vi Lyles, issued a statement calling the crime senseless and tragic. She urged the community to stand with Iryna's grieving family. Across the city, vigils were planned, and people began leaving flowers at the East/West Boulevard station where the attack occurred. As more details emerged, the public learned that the suspect, 34-year-old DeCarlos Brown Jr., had a long and troubled history. He had been arrested 14 times before, with convictions for armed robbery and firearm possession. Diagnosed with schizophrenia, he had cycled through shelters, jails, and short-lived treatment programs. His mother had pleaded for him to be committed, but her requests were denied. For many, this was not just a story of one violent act, it was a case study in the cracks of the mental health and criminal justice systems. In the days following the killing, questions of safety on Charlotte's Lynx Blue Line grew louder. City council members voiced concerns that riders would lose trust in public transit. Officials admitted that while officers had been on the train, they were in another car and could not prevent the stabbing in time. Charlotte Area Transit System, CATS, vowed to review its policies, promising more officers, stricter fare inspections, and better surveillance. On September 5, 2025, CATS released the surveillance footage of the stabbing. The video, disturbing and graphic, sparked outrage nationwide. It showed Iryna sitting calmly in front of Brown, unaware of the danger behind her, followed by the sudden, brutal attack. Many who saw it described feeling haunted by the images. Politicians across North Carolina weighed in. Governor Josh Stein called for more cops on the beat and pressed lawmakers to address officer shortages. Councilwoman Dimple Ejmera openly stated, "Clearly, our current safety policies are not enough." Others feared the tragedy would derail public support for expanding the city's transit system. Nationally, the story became highly politicized. Conservative commentators accused mainstream outlets of downplaying the murder because the victim was a white Ukrainian refugee and the suspect was a black American man, contrasting it with the coverage of the Jordan Neely case in New York. U.S. Secretary of Transportation Sean Duffy publicly blamed Charlotte officials, while billionaire Elon Musk criticized judges and prosecutors for letting dangerous criminals roam free. Even the President of the United States, Donald Trump, addressed the killing. Speaking at the Museum of the Bible, he called Brown a madman and a lunatic, demanding stronger measures against violent offenders. In a video later released by the White House, Trump said Iryna had been slaughtered by a deranged monster. His words echoed across social media, amplifying both grief and anger. Internationally, Ukraine's Ministry of Foreign Affairs confirmed they were in close contact with investigators. Ukrainian media portrayed Iryna as a symbol of resilience, a young woman who had survived Russian airstrikes only to meet her death in a place she thought was safe. In the United Kingdom, newspapers described the crime as fueling debates about rising violence in America. Meanwhile, in Charlotte, the community mourned. On August 31st, a candlelight vigil was held for Iryna. Hundreds gathered, holding candles and flowers, remembering her smile and her courage. Friends described her as hardworking, kind, and determined to build a future. She had loved art, had studied restoration in Kiev, and had hoped one day to open her own gallery. Instead, her life ended on a train ride home. The killing quickly became political. What began as a shocking act of violence inside a Charlotte light rail train soon turned into a flashpoint in national debate. Local leaders, state officials, and even international voices weighed in, each framing the tragedy through the lens of their own agendas. Charlotte's Mayor Vi Lyles called it senseless and tragic. Her statement struck a tone of grief and urgency, urging the city to stand together and demanding respect for the victim's grieving family. She also acknowledged the growing fear among riders who wondered whether public transit in Charlotte was truly safe. President Donald Trump described the attacker as a madman and a lunatic. Speaking at the Museum of the Bible just weeks after the crime, Trump's words carried a hard edge. He said that when horrible killings occur, you have to take horrible actions. His message was clear. America, in his view, had grown too lenient, allowing violent offenders to slip through the cracks. Elon Musk accused judges and district attorneys of letting criminals roam free. In a viral post, the billionaire directly blamed the justice system, criticizing what he called a culture of permissiveness. His comments reignited a nationwide conversation about bail reform, repeat offenders, and whether courts were truly protecting ordinary citizens. The case raised troubling questions about public safety, justice, and America's broken mental health system. How could a man with a long history of arrests and a known diagnosis of schizophrenia have been free and untreated? Why had his mother's pleas for help been ignored? And why was there no one in the train car to intervene before the violence unfolded? For some, the killing symbolized the failure of America's transit security. For others, it was proof of a crumbling mental health infrastructure. And for many, it was a heartbreaking reminder that behind every statistic, there is a real human life, cut short in a moment of senseless brutality. Iryna's death gained international attention. Ukraine's foreign ministry said it was in constant contact with U.S. investigators. Across the United States, murals were painted in her honor. On August 31st, a candlelight vigil was held. A second memorial followed on September 22nd. American rapper DaBaby released a song titled "Save Me," dedicated to Iryna. She had fled a war to survive. Only to lose her life on a city train, in the very country where she hoped to find safety. Iryna's death gained international attention. Ukraine's foreign ministry said it was in constant contact with U.S. investigators. Across the United States, murals were painted in her honor. On August 31st, a candlelight vigil was held. A second memorial followed on September 22nd. American rapper DaBaby released a song titled "Save Me," dedicated to Iryna. She had fled a war to survive, only to lose her life on a city train, in the very country where she hoped to find safety.
Iryna Zarutska's story does not end here. Because after this story begins the story of Charlie Kirk. A story in which he himself was attacked and was shot by a man.
The defense, however, hinted at a different story. They raised the possibility of mental health struggles, suggesting Robinson had been overwhelmed by personal turmoil and ideological confusion. They described him as someone who had once leaned conservative, only to experience a radical shift that left him conflicted and unstable. For them, the goal was not to excuse the killing, but to argue against the death penalty by presenting Robinson as a disturbed individual rather than a hardened political assassin. Outside the courthouse, the public's reactions mirrored America's deep divisions. Vigils were held by Kirk's supporters, who framed his death as martyrdom for conservative values. At the same time, student groups and activists debated whether his style of politics had fostered the very conditions that led to the tragedy. Media outlets covered every development, from the evidence introduced in hearings to the emotional testimonies of those who had witnessed the chaos on campus. As the trial gained momentum, it became clear that this case was about more than just one man's actions. It symbolized a larger national crisis, the question of how far political polarization had gone, and whether America could still debate ideas without resorting to violence. Each court session, each filing, and each headline seemed to pull the country deeper into reflection on its own fractured identity. And so the question lingers, hanging over the trial like a shadow. Was the murder of Charlie Kirk a direct assault on the principle of free speech? Or the inevitable eruption of tensions fueled by years of hate-filled rhetoric? Whichever answer history settles on, one fact remains undeniable: the outcome of this trial will not only decide Tyler Robinson's fate but may also shape how America defines the boundaries of speech, dissent, and violence in the years to come. Tyler Robinson was arrested and charged with aggravated murder. Prosecutors announced that the death penalty could be sought, especially if the killing is proven to be politically motivated. As the trial moves forward, the case has sparked a national debate. Was this murder an attack on free speech? Or the consequence of hate-filled rhetoric? The arrest of Tyler James Robinson marked the beginning of one of the most closely watched criminal cases in recent American history. Within hours of the shooting, police presented him before the media as the prime suspect. The charge, aggravated murder, carried with it the gravest possible penalty under Utah law. During Robinson's first court appearance, the prosecution laid out the chilling evidence. They cited the text messages he sent to his partner immediately after the attack, the surveillance footage placing him near the rooftop, and eyewitness accounts that aligned with his movements. This combination of digital and physical evidence left little doubt about his role in the killing. Prosecutors then made a stunning announcement: they would consider pursuing the death penalty. Their reasoning was clear. If the jury agreed that the murder was politically motivated, that Robinson killed Kirk specifically because of his public speech and political activities, then it would not be treated as an ordinary homicide. Instead, it would be elevated to the most severe category of crime, the targeted assassination of a public figure for ideological reasons. This declaration immediately ignited nationwide debate. Supporters of Charlie Kirk argued that this was, without question, an attack on free speech. They insisted that if political leaders could be killed for their words, the very foundation of American democracy was at risk. To them, Robinson's actions represented an attempt to silence an opposing viewpoint through violence. Something far more dangerous than disagreement or protest. But others saw the case differently. Kirk's critics pointed to years of inflammatory rhetoric, suggesting that his speeches themselves had contributed to a culture of hostility and division. From this perspective, Robinson's actions, while unjustifiable, were seen as the tragic byproduct of words that had sown anger and resentment. This side of the debate asked a painful question: when does provocative speech cross the line into incitement, and what responsibility does a public figure bear for the consequences of their words? As legal proceedings unfolded, the courtroom became a battleground of narratives. The prosecution focused on premeditation, arguing that Robinson had deliberately studied Kirk's schedule, chosen his location, and carried out the shooting with calculated intent. They painted a portrait of a young man who crossed from political disagreement into cold-blooded murder. Meanwhile, Robinson's defense attorneys began crafting a different narrative. They hinted at possible mental health struggles, the emotional strain of identity conflicts, and the toxic environment of online political discourse. But the challenge remained enormous. Their client had admitted in his own words that he pulled the trigger. As the case unfolded, the story of Tyler James Robinson became as polarizing as Charlie Kirk's life itself. To some, Robinson was a misguided young man pushed to violence by relentless ideological battles. To others, he was nothing more than a cold-blooded murderer who assassinated a public figure for his beliefs. The echoes of his words, "I did it because Kirk spreads hate," continue to haunt the debate. Were they the words of a political vigilante, a disturbed individual, or both? For the nation, those words reopened deep wounds about free speech, extremism, and whether violent responses can ever be justified in the face of rhetoric one disagrees with. In the end, investigators painted a picture of a calculated act: a 22-year-old who chose a political figure as his target, carried out a public killing, and confessed not out of remorse, but out of conviction that his actions were justified. This single decision, and the chilling explanation behind it, transformed Tyler James Robinson from an anonymous young man into the central figure in one of America's most consequential political crimes of the decade. Investigators quickly identified the shooter as 22-year-old Tyler James Robinson. Moments after the attack, Robinson sent text messages to his partner, openly admitting that he had pulled the trigger. According to prosecutors, he claimed, "I did it because Kirk spreads hate." The speed at which investigators identified Robinson was remarkable. Surveillance footage from the university campus, combined with eyewitness accounts, allowed authorities to track his movements within minutes of the shooting. Multiple students reported seeing a figure positioned near a rooftop parking structure, the very place from which the single bullet had been fired. Police scanners captured the urgency of the hunt. Officers cordoned off entire blocks surrounding Utah Valley University, helicopters circling overhead as SWAT teams entered nearby buildings. Within hours, law enforcement located Robinson in a vehicle less than 10 miles from the campus. But even before his arrest, Robinson had already confessed, not to police, but in private text messages to his partner. According to prosecutors, these texts revealed both his intent and his justification. He wrote that he had deliberately targeted Charlie Kirk, stating that Kirk's rhetoric, particularly his repeated condemnation of LGBTQ rights, had pushed him over the edge. Screenshots of those messages, later presented in court filings, became critical evidence. In them, Robinson made no attempt to deny his role. Instead, he framed his actions as a form of retribution against what he perceived as hate speech. One chilling line stood out: "I did it because Kirk spreads hate." Investigators also uncovered Robinson's recent online activity. Just weeks before the shooting, he had posted comments in support of LGBTQ advocacy groups, sharply criticizing Kirk's public positions. Friends told reporters that Robinson had undergone a dramatic political shift. Once leaning conservative, but now embracing progressive causes. This ideological change, prosecutors argued, was central to his motive. When taken into custody, Robinson reportedly showed little resistance. Police described him as calm, even resigned. Officers noted that he seemed fully aware of the gravity of his actions and the likelihood of spending the rest of his life in prison. The prosecution later emphasized that this was not a random act of violence. It was targeted, planned, and carried out with clear intent. Robinson had allegedly researched Kirk's speaking schedule and traveled specifically to Utah Valley University knowing he would be there. In the courtroom, the weight of his confession loomed heavily. Prosecutors argued that the text messages, combined with surveillance evidence and eyewitness testimony, left little room for doubt. They announced they would pursue the harshest possible sentence, including the death penalty, given the political nature of the killing. Inside Utah Valley University, as Kirk's lecture was underway, the atmosphere suddenly turned tense. A single gunshot rang out, fired from above, outside the building. Within seconds, the shocking news spread. Charlie Kirk had been struck by a bullet. Witnesses recall the scene as one of sheer panic. Students and faculty members in the packed auditorium heard what sounded like a loud crack, at first mistaken by some for a dropped object or technical malfunction. But within moments, screams echoed as people realized it was gunfire. Security personnel shouted for everyone to get down as chaos erupted inside the hall. Police later confirmed that the gunman had positioned himself outside, firing from an elevated location near the lecture building. The bullet pierced through glass before striking Kirk, who collapsed on stage in front of a stunned audience. Emergency medical staff stationed at the event rushed to provide aid. They attempted chest compressions and applied pressure to the wound as horrified students pulled out their phones, some calling 911 while others recorded fragments of the unfolding tragedy. Kirk was quickly carried out on a stretcher and transported to a nearby hospital. Despite every effort to stabilize him, doctors announced his death shortly after arrival. The official cause, a single gunshot wound. The university immediately went into lockdown. Hundreds of students were evacuated, while police and SWAT teams swarmed the campus in search of the shooter. Social media lit up with live updates, blurry videos, and terrified accounts from those inside, amplifying the shock nationwide within minutes. For many in that lecture hall, the moment felt surreal. A political speech transformed instantly into a crime scene, and an ordinary day on campus into one of the darkest in its history. Charlie Kirk was the founder of Turning Point USA, an organization that claimed to spread conservative ideas among students and young voters. To his supporters, he was a defender of free speech. But to his critics, Kirk was a divisive figure who fueled polarization and intolerance. Turning Point USA, the group Kirk launched in 2012 when he was only 18, grew into one of the most influential conservative student organizations in the United States. Headquartered in Arizona, the nonprofit claimed to have chapters on more than 3,000 high school and college campuses across the country. Its stated mission was to promote free markets, limited government, and what Kirk called traditional American values. For conservatives, Kirk's rise symbolized a new generation of activism. He frequently appeared on Fox News, hosted his own podcast, and advised high-profile Republican figures, even cultivating ties with Donald Trump. His followers saw him as a young voice challenging what they viewed as left-wing dominance in higher education, where conservative students often felt silenced. But the picture looked very different to his critics. Turning Point USA was often accused of spreading disinformation, targeting liberal professors, and creating watch lists of educators deemed hostile to conservative ideology. Civil rights organizations repeatedly criticized Kirk for comments seen as anti-immigrant, anti-LGBTQ, or racially charged. To many, he represented not just conservative thought, but a brand of politics that sharpened divisions and thrived on outrage. This dual perception, hero to one side, agitator to the other, is what made Kirk one of the most polarizing figures in modern American politics. His lectures and rallies frequently attracted protests, and his name became synonymous with the cultural battles raging across campuses and online spaces. September 10, 2025. Utah Valley University, Orem, Utah. A day that would mark one of the most shocking moments in American political life. On this day, Charlie Kirk, a well-known yet controversial political activist, was shot and killed. That morning, Kirk had been scheduled to deliver a campus lecture, part of his nationwide speaking tour aimed at college students. The event drew both supporters and protesters, reflecting the deep divide that had long surrounded his presence on university grounds. According to police reports, the shot was fired from an elevated outdoor position near the building, piercing through the atmosphere of what had begun as a routine event. Students inside the lecture hall described chaos breaking out instantly, screams, people ducking for cover, and security rushing toward Kirk. Emergency responders arrived within minutes, but the injuries proved fatal. Despite immediate medical efforts, Charlie Kirk was pronounced dead shortly after being transported to a local hospital. Authorities quickly identified the shooter as 22-year-old Tyler James Robinson, who, prosecutors later revealed, sent text messages to his partner confessing to the act. Robinson allegedly justified the shooting by saying Kirk spread hate, citing his outspoken opposition to LGBTQ rights and other progressive causes. The killing ignited national shockwaves. Conservative circles mourned Kirk as a martyr for free speech, while critics emphasized that his rhetoric had long provoked heated backlash. Utah Valley University canceled classes for the following day, holding vigils for those traumatized by the event. The legal case against Robinson moved swiftly. He was charged with aggravated murder and several related offenses. Prosecutors announced they may seek the death penalty, particularly if the crime is proven to be politically motivated. This single act of violence transformed a campus lecture into a national flashpoint, raising questions not only about political extremism but also about whether America's cultural divisions had reached a breaking point. As the trial of Tyler Robinson moved forward, these questions only deepened. Every court hearing seemed to reignite the discussion: was America becoming a place where political disagreement could no longer be expressed safely? Could universities still host controversial speakers without fearing violence? Some leaders called for unity, urging citizens to reject violence regardless of political affiliation. Others doubled down, using the event to galvanize their own side, further fueling the same polarization that had set the stage for tragedy. And so the nation finds itself at a crossroads. On one path lies dialogue, the hard, messy work of debating ideas without resorting to violence. On the other lies division, a future where every ideological conflict risks spiraling into bloodshed. The shooting of Charlie Kirk has left behind more than grief. It has left America staring into a mirror, forced to ask whether it can still bridge its differences, or whether the divide has already gone too far. To Kirk's supporters, he died defending freedom of expression. To his critics, his politics set the stage for this violent end. At Utah Valley University, students remain in shock and mourning. And across the nation, the shooting has reignited one central question: can America resolve political differences through dialogue? Or is it heading further into deadly division? In the days following the shooting, candlelight vigils were held across the country. At Utah Valley University, students gathered on the campus lawn, holding signs that read, "Free speech must live on," and "Violence is not the answer." Many of those present admitted that they didn't even agree with Charlie Kirk's politics, but they felt a deep unease at the idea that words and speeches could now be answered with bullets. Among Kirk's supporters, the narrative was clear: he had become a martyr. Conservative media framed his death as proof that freedom of expression was under attack, warning that no voice was safe if ideological opponents were willing to resort to violence. Across right-leaning platforms, his killing was portrayed as the silencing of a man who dared to challenge the mainstream. But to his critics, the story looked very different. Progressive voices argued that while the act of violence was indefensible, Kirk's rhetoric had long carried consequences. They pointed to years of controversial remarks on immigration, race, gender, and sexuality that had fueled resentment and division. For them, the tragedy was less about silencing speech and more about what happens when polarizing figures thrive on outrage without considering the human cost. At Utah Valley University, the atmosphere was one of grief mixed with fear. Professors spoke of classrooms filled with silence, students too shaken to focus on lessons. Counseling centers reported a surge in visits, as young people struggled to process the trauma of witnessing violence so close to their daily lives. Some students admitted they no longer felt safe attending large campus events, worried that political disagreements could once again spill into deadly action. Nationally, the shooting became the centerpiece of a broader cultural debate. Television networks hosted panels of commentators, politicians, and academics, each offering a different lens. Was Robinson's act the extreme end of a culture that demonizes political opponents? Or was it the predictable outcome of rhetoric that many argued had itself flirted with hate? Even within families and communities, arguments broke out. Dinner tables turned into battlegrounds as relatives clashed over who bore responsibility, the gunman alone, or a society that had allowed political hostility to spiral unchecked. Social media amplified these divisions, with hashtags honoring Kirk trending alongside ones condemning his legacy.